All right, so it's noon. I guess I will go ahead and get started. Thank you to all of you who have joined us in this very unique environment and to the folks who put this together, which is, I think it's pretty badass. Feel free to give some emojis to the folks who've done this because, I mean, what an amazing environment to even be doing this in. I can't even imagine. So anyway, my name is Catherine Ullman. I work at the University at Buffalo and predominantly a blue teamer. And I'm going to talk today about some things that I learned about incident response from being a firefighter, which is a different kind of, it really is incident response in just a very different kind of way. So let's see. Trying to. Ooh, did we get to the next slide? I'm not seeing it. Nope, now we went way too far.
Yeah, just be real patient with the load.
All right. Here we go. So this is the agenda. This is basically what we'll cover. We'll talk about what incident response is. We'll cover IR and firefighting and firefighting 101 and what I call challenges and opportunities, because basically I started out with 6 things that I didn't want to say good things and bad things because that just sounded lame. I'll summarize some stuff and then I'll give you some final thoughts. So a little about me. This is me on the computer security side. Like I said, I'm at the University of Buffalo. I've been there over 20 years. I'm on staff with some conferences. I'm about to step down as the VP of the ISSA chapter here. I volunteer with a bunch of things. I've done a lot of speaking. I have a few certs, that kind of stuff. Any of you who have seen me might have seen that, but you probably have not seen this. So just to show that I have a little cred in the other side of this universe as well, I offer this slide, which talks about the fact that I've been a state fire instructor for a number of years. I did a bunch of credits toward a degree in fire protection technology that I never really needed to finish, but I did a bunch of the core fire stuff. I was a certified fire investigator, and that's the New York State certification. And up until last year, I held the national certification as a fire investigator. I am also a fire instructor, and I used to be part of DFIR. So that is just a little bit about my fire background. So I've been in the fire service, I think I'm going on about 24 years now. And just in case you don't believe me, that's me in the middle, oops, with what's called a thermal imaging camera. A thermal imaging camera is what we use in the fire service to basically look at things and determine where the hot spots are versus the cold spots. They give us some indication basically as to where to find the fire. It's useful for a lot of things. But anyway, we had just shown up for this particular fire, which I'm going to give some other examples of, but I thought you might want to see me in my gear, kind of validate this is exactly who I say I am. So what is incident response? Let's talk about that. So it's this process of addressing network events, and basically it can be proactive or reactive, and it's any event that's going to affect this CIA triangle. And I point out here that these are the technical components required to analyze and contain an incident, because we're going to see in a minute that that differentiates from something else. So these are our goals with incident response, and any of you who've done IR in the past, you obviously would be familiar with this. You want to make sure that you're aware when an incident is happening. You want to stop any sort of attacker, minimize that damage, and of course, prevent any follow-on attacks, similar incidents, that sort of thing. These are the standard phases of incident response. You're going to prepare for it. You're going to identify when something happens. You're going to contain it when it does happen. Try to get rid of the bad guy, recover from it. And then ideally, you'll learn some lessons from what happened. Again, this should be relatively familiar if you know anything about IR. Some terminology, this just talks about what those different phases mean. So as part of preparation, you might do some documentation. You might want to document your environment so you know where your assets are and what they are, maybe build some tools. You want to be aware of the attacks. So sometimes you find out through third parties. Sometimes you have tools in-house that will teach you about what's out there. When the badness happens, you're going to do some basic containment. You're going to patch and you're going to block any C2 stuff that's going on. You might pull the power out of a system or pull a network cable out. In terms of eradication, so you're going to get rid of the bad guy, you're going to do some sort of remediation, remove a compromised host, maybe wipe a box and rebuild it. And then recovery is going to be about restoring those business functions specifically. So whatever business functions were interrupted by this, that's what you're going to restore. And of course, lessons learned. What did we learn from all of this? You don't want to have the same mistake twice. So ideally, you want to learn something from what happened and prevent it from happening again. So incident handling, and this is why I broke up incident response the way I did, is a separate idea. And we mix these two up frequently. In a small organization, it's very difficult sometimes not to do that because you may not have a separate person who can do incident handling versus the response. So the response is the technical stuff we talked about, but the handling is about communicating what's going on, the logistics, the coordination within the organization, all of these pieces that also need to be going on at the same time that the incident responders within that incident actually acting and doing those technical things. Ideally, you want to have somebody in your corner who's handling those logistics and that communication for you. Now, in a small company, obviously, that's just not going to be an option. You're going to wind up having to do this yourself. But I pointed this out because these in the fire service are completely separate roles, and you'll see that. And I think it's important to note that they really should be in the ideal world. And obviously, we don't live in an ideal world, so sometimes you'll see this and sometimes you won't. So this could be obvious, but I thought I'd just keep with the same structure here. What is firefighting? It's this active, preventing fire spread. You're going to extinguish the fire. And I specifically mention unwanted fires in buildings, vehicles, woodlands, etc., because I know some people start fire on purpose. Maybe you're somebody who burns leaves because you live out in the country and that's something that you do regularly. Leaves or brush or something, that's actually pretty common. So obviously as a firefighter, we don't want to come and show up at your house when you're having a cookout and you're making s'mores and put your fire out, because that would be crazy. So I mentioned it's this unwanted spread. Our goals, obviously, as firefighters, are to protect the health and safety of ourselves as well as the public, people's property, whether it's public property or private property, and obviously just minimize any sort of disruption of any kind of community activity. We have a very similar preparedness cycle. Now that you've seen the IR cycle, you should see that this is very similar. The big difference is we're going to do, in the fire service, we're going to do some preparation. And preparation is always going to be essentially what happens sort of day to day. That's going to ultimately lead to us being called out for some kind of emergency, where we're then going to respond to the emergency. We'll then recover from whatever that was, perhaps do some mitigation and some preparation. So while the cycle is broken up a little differently, you should see some pretty similar aspects of these two. So breaking it down, what do we mean by these steps? Well, mitigation is going to be preventing future emergencies. So putting things in place to prevent fires would be things like smoke detectors. So that doesn't prevent the fire per se, but it could prevent it from getting out of hand. Sprinkler systems are a great example of mitigation, and we should have way more of them in buildings than we do. Once the emergency has, gotten to a point, these are unfortunately slightly out of order, but we want to be prepared to handle an emergency. So we're going to do things like pre-planning. So this, as you saw, is very similar to the kind of pre-planning we're going to do in an incident response. Ideally, much like you want to know where your assets are, you want to know about buildings, and you want to know what they are, what kind of function they serve, maybe what chemicals are in them, what the layout is. We need to make sure our gear is maintained, that the air packs we wear on our backs are full of air and ready to go and going to work in that emergency situation. Obviously, when we respond to a fire or other emergency, we're going to try to respond there safely because we want to save property and lives. And then ultimately, we've got to recover from this emergency. We're going to clean up, and then maybe somebody else is going to come out and do a restoration or repairs on the building or facility, whatever was burning or in trouble. So where we're headed with this, I want you to take a look at these pictures. Now, I was at the fire. You saw the picture of me much earlier where I was holding that thermal imaging camera. And one of the things I wound up doing a lot at this fire was changing air bottles. Air bottles are the tanks that go into a frame, for those of you who are not familiar, that allows firefighters to breathe air inside a building safely. It's much like a scuba tank, if you've ever seen something like that. And these bottles are good, especially the standard bottles are 30 to 45 minutes on air. The problem is you don't really get 30 or 45 minutes on air because when you're working really hard, you suck a lot more air and you basically run out of air faster. So when a firefighter runs out of air, they come out and they get a bottle change. And the problem with the bottle change is that you can only have that done a couple of times before you're not allowed to go back into a fire. In any case, I'm doing bottle changes. This firefighter comes out. I go to change out his bottle. So that's essentially what you see on the right. You can see me leaning over him to take that bottle out. And when I go to put the new bottle in, I reconnect everything and I get blasted with air in the face. This is not normal. If you look at the right side of the screen and you see that image, you'll notice there's actually a fair amount of blackened gook on the shoulder of that particular firefighter. If you had been able to see the rest of the back of his jacket, the whole left side of the back of his jacket was actually singed. And this is a problem because I was not paying attention to that and he wasn't paying attention to that. And what actually happened was the frame and the tubing for that air pack had been damaged in the fire. He was so focused on helping put that fire out, and I was so focused on my job in terms of getting that air bottle replaced that I didn't pay attention. And thankfully, I got a blast of air in the face and it was fine, but it could have been so much worse. So these are the kinds of things we run into, and I will talk in a moment. We'll talk about the kinds of lessons I've learned from things of this nature. This is just sort of a preview. All right, so a couple other pieces of terminology. I know what most of you are familiar with, ICS in our computer security world, but ICS in the fire service is the Incident Command System. And I like this quote at the bottom. It's an organized response to a problem. It's a hierarchy that allows us to work a small incident, but if the incident starts to grow, we can add more and more pieces, and it still remains very manageable. So there's a little tree here that kind of illustrates that. You'll see at the top there's something called an incident commander, and that's usually your fire chief who's running the show. The other really important person to note in this is your operations person. So your incident commander, we'll see in a minute, runs the show. Operations is going to talk to command and get a sense of what they want and then make it happen. The other pieces, of course, the safety officer is important for keeping folks safe. And here's kind of that breakdown. So your IC will define those goals. Operations is going to handle strategy and tactics. Logistics is going to be about personnel, supplies, equipment, trying to get folks together. Your planning and your admin finance aren't going to necessarily be needed in a smaller situation, but you can imagine if this is a multi-building fire or something bigger like an earthquake, a flood, or some other major catastrophe, hurricane, whatever, you can see where planning and administrative or finance stuff could come into play. So let's compare these two things. You can see these methodologies are really similar. As we saw with those cycles, both of them contain some form of preparation, identification is we see an incident response, but really that's not unlike what we see in firefighting, because obviously we get a phone call that says there's a problem, and that's really going to be part of the response. You know, all of these things are really very, very similar, and you see they both end with lessons learned. Even though the official cycle in firefighting doesn't have that lessons learned component, I can tell you with absolute certainty, as part of recovery, lessons learned is part of it. We do try to get together and critique fire situations to see how well we've done with them. By the way, normally I would be pacing back and forth on the stage, but I really just can't do that here. So here are some significant differences that I wanted to just point out. So incident response very rarely involves life safety, except in healthcare. So I'm very, very fond of saying things like, this is not a life safety issue. No one is going to die if we don't get this network or whatever component back up and running again. And of course, that's very different if you're talking about hospitals or doctor's offices and healthcare in general. But on the whole, that is true. We're normally paid doing incident response. We use computers and software. Firefighters, on the other hand, have to wear special gear. Normally, when we're doing incident response, we don't have to wear any special clothes. That's just, you know, the way that is. We don't show up in special vehicles, but firefighters certainly do. We come in our big fancy fire trucks, and we, as firefighters, are using some water, foam, chemicals, whatever, to put the fire out. We don't usually do that in IR. However, some distinct similarities. We focus on the immediate issue first. We're not going to worry about the cause until later. That's very true in the fire service as well. We're going to have somebody, whether it's when I was doing fire investigation, you're going to go in and you're going to find the origin and the cause of the fire. You might do the same thing with incident response. Same idea. You're going to try to figure out exactly what happened. You're going to use some form of triage, right? You're not going to just ideally try to handle all the things at once. You're going to take them and you're going to try to determine whether or not certain items are more critical than others. It's a cyclic nature, right? We saw that with those two cycles, really similar. So they start with some form of documentation and pre-planning, and, you know, ends with that whole lessons learned thing. They often both require thinking outside the box. I have a friend who's a firefighter in a city department that's about an hour from where I live. He had a call where they had to rescue a very large gentleman who's about 600 pounds off a very tall story of a building. And there was no way to just get him out the door and down the steps. So he wound up going to Home Depot and buying a bunch of equipment and cobbling something together that they could use to lift him up and get him out of the building. And certainly in incident response, we're not lifting people out of buildings, but we are sometimes finding unique ways to use tools that we have in our collection to be able to determine how something happened or fix something. We're thinking outside that box. We often, in both cases, have to bring in outside entities. So you may have an IR team within your organization, but maybe you need more help, or maybe you don't have an IR team and you have to hire outside. And with the fire service, that's the same thing. You know, we, in the village that I live in, we sometimes have to call in mutual aid and bring in other folks because it's a big enough issue, or maybe we need specialty equipment. And sometimes companies have inside teams. So if you work in a factory, sometimes larger factories or other manufacturing facilities will have their own firefighting team, and sometimes they don't. So, and certainly the same goes with IR. So now that we've seen some sort of general similarities and distinctions, we're going to talk about what I call challenges, which are what I would refer to as kind of the bad things, right? These are the kinds of things I've learned as a firefighter can really get in the way and be significantly problematic, both in the universe of IR and in the universe of firefighting. And as a firefighter, I sort of recognized these things. And as an IR person, as I started to do incident response, I realized, wow, these are really the same problem. So the first one I'll mention here is tunnel vision. When you get tunnel vision, really you are only seeing one portion of the problem. You're not seeing that big picture. And when you're not seeing that big picture, you can make some really bad decisions. So here's an example. This is the same fire I showed you that you saw with me with the camera and then me changing the bottle. So take a look at this picture. And if you were to come on this scene, as we did, right after these cones were placed, you'd say, huh, those cones are protecting something. But realistically, since you don't really see anything, you might not think there's a real problem there. But what you can't see is you can't see the live wire. If I had a pointer and I could show you, you can kind of see where it is, but it's very, very difficult to see. And so this is a really serious problem. If we just went running in pell-mell and nobody saw that down wire, you could get really seriously injured. So there are some parallels in incident response in the computer universe. So first of all, is the scene safe? Now, it may be in your environment where you're always going to a server room that's perfectly fine and there's no problems. But what if you're going to a server room that suddenly has, oh, I don't know, gallons of water flowing into it because something broke or, there's a flood or whatever? The scene may or may not be safe. And the first thing we're taught as firefighters is to ask ourselves, is this scene safe? Now, obviously, a burning building is not safe in and of itself, but you saw, even with the cone issue that I just showed you, that it doesn't really matter whether we're talking about a burning building or a server room. You should be asking those same questions, because even to do the job you've been called to do, in our firefighting case, put out the fire, in the incident response case, actually respond to the incident, if you can't get in there and do your job safely, then you are no good to anybody. So ask yourself, what are you dealing with too? Is this, malware? Like if you go running in because somebody has told you there's malware, it's the end of the world, it's a bad thing, and you assume it's malware, you're going to be so focused on that you're going to miss, maybe it's something just simple like a misconfiguration. Are you going to maybe do, maybe you're a forensics person and you do blind hardware, and you do blind hardware acquisition. A friend of mine who works in England for the federal government was on a case where somebody went in and yanked a bunch of equipment out. Well, unfortunately, all of that stuff was encrypted, and she wasn't able to get the decryption for about half of it. And had they gone in and instead of being so focused on pulling that equipment, realized that it was encrypted, they might have been able to pull the key first. And how about something like, sort of like the malware misconfiguration example? What if somebody gets a phishing email that everybody assumes is ransomware? And now you think you're in the middle of a major ransomware case, but really it was just a phishing email, which is bad enough, but it can lead to overreaction. Oop, wrong way. Come on. All right, so our second challenge is reactionary behavior, which you can see is very much tied to this whole tunnel vision idea. If you're going to allow outside forces to influence what you're doing, it can sometimes cause that tunnel vision we talked about. So if you're not relying on the documentation you have and you're just reacting, you have this sort of emotional response where you're running in and doing something, especially because someone else is freaking out, you often forget that the bigger picture is out there. So I use this as an example. Now I'll start out by saying, if anybody saw this particular fire, this happened in Worcester, Massachusetts. This was several years ago. This was a very, very serious fire. It was very sad. As you can see, 6 firefighters lost their lives. The real underlying problem with this particular fire was the fact that they didn't have pre-plans and nobody knew the building. But I'm going to show you why this was also a reactionary problem. So this building was built in 1906. It had been vacant for many, many, many years. However, when they got the call of fire, it was thought there were some vagrants living in the building. So they send in 2 firefighters for a search and rescue mission. They want to sweep the area and see if in fact there were people to rescue, because that's really always our first priority is human life. Unfortunately, when those 2 firefighters got in there, they ran into a maze of meat lockers in a just ridiculous situation. I didn't have enough space to be able to show you, but there are some photographs, if you Google this fire, of the inside of this building and just how convoluted it was. But because they had done no pre-planning, nobody had any sense of this. Well, of course, these 2 individuals get lost, and they radio back to the incident commander or the operations staff, and they say, you know, oh my God, we're lost, help us. So what does the chief do? The chief sends in 2 more firefighters. Those 2 firefighters also get lost, never finding the first 2 firefighters. So the emotional response is send 2 more firefighters in to try to help these people. We've now lost, at this point, 6 firefighters. All 6 firefighters are lost. And the fire chief finally had to make the decision not to send anybody else in, which was a horribly difficult decision for him. And he was devastated, and people were very angry with him for not sending more people in. But realistically, when he sent the first couple of people in, he didn't send them in with ropes. There should have been what's called a rapid intervention team, a RIT team, waiting, so that if those first 2 individuals were trapped, that team, it's their job to rescue people. That's it. Not put the fire out, nothing else. But instead of calling in a RIT team, the chief freaks out and sends in 2 more of his own guys. So now we have all this reactionary behavior that, on top of all these other problems, helps to cause this really serious fatality situation. So it was very sad, and we lost a bunch of people, and this is reactionary. So in the incident universe, there's similar behavior. Note the picture on the right. How many times do you get somebody, especially in upper management, when you have an incident, just cut the cord, pull the cord, just turn it off, right? Well, you can lose a lot of really sensitive information that way. You could lose the keys to the case. You could lose the keys to, encryption, same problem, right? Another thing that I find reactionary behavior causes, and I've had cases like this myself, is somebody asking you to do forensics without a clear or explicit goal. They'll say, go in and find the bad thing. Well, what the hell's the bad thing? Like, that doesn't tell me anything. Forensics should always be very, very concrete in terms of what you're looking for, or, and it's okay if it's a needle in a haystack per se, as long as you know exactly what that needle is. The problem is if people are freaking out and they're like, just find the bad thing, well, you don't really know what you're looking for. And that's problematic, because then you can wind up going down rabbit holes that aren't important at all. Same problem we see with cutting cables is just turning off machines. Another problem might be, you have one account that's compromised, and because somebody's freaking out, you have a situation where somebody says, let's just shut off all accounts because the one person is, the one account we see is compromised, and therefore it must be the whole system. Maybe not the best idea, because maybe it is just that one account. So freelancing. In the incident response universe and in the computer universe in general, freelancing means something very different. Typically with freelancing in that universe, we're talking about folks that are maybe contractors who come in and work on their own. But freelancing in the fire service is what you see here. It's this idea of going off and kind of doing your own thing and not following any form of chain of command or a team leader. And this can be dangerous. It can be problematic. You can cause bad feelings because the people are stepping on each other's toes. And so I found that this is a problem in both areas too. So for firefighting, I give you the crossing of the streams, okay? When I say the crossing of the streams, what do I mean here? Well, I literally mean somebody is going through a window on one side and going, say, through a door on another side, and they're literally hitting each other with water. This is bad. This is uncoordinated, and it's a mess, and it can cause serious injury. Very similarly, freelancing can feed what we call feed a fire. So a fire needs three things to survive. It needs a heat source, it needs oxygen, and it needs fuel. If you cut any one of those things, you have no fire, or you have less fire. So one of the things we're taught as firefighters is to minimize or try to find a way to limit those things. If any of you who have ever seen any of the ads that showed a close your bedroom door at night, because that would prevent fire from getting in your bedroom, even if it's right outside the door, this is the kind of thing we're talking about. Fire is fed by air currents. And so sometimes what you see is you'll get some firefighters who think they're being really helpful by knocking out windows and yanking out and opening doors without it being a coordinated effort. And so what ends up happening is that fire that's in one portion of a house that easily could be put out winds up spreading through an entire structure. Not ideal. And, but we see, again, something really similar within incident response. Obviously, we're not talking about hose lines here, but we are seeing similar stuff. How about people who just go in and collect everything? Number one, do you even have the rights to take all the things? Maybe all the things is too much stuff. Maybe you're not collecting, somebody goes off and says, I'm just going to grab this stuff, and it's not the right stuff. There are situations where you wind up with duplication of effort because somebody is collecting data on one side of the room and another person doesn't realize it's been done, and they come over and they do the same data collection. Now you've wasted time because there's been a duplication of effort. You could even have a situation where somebody's freelancing because maybe they want to inject some badness into this situation. Maybe they're going to alter what ultimate conclusions are made by not collecting the right data or changing it. So, same idea. All right, so now let's talk about the good stuff. Patience. It's an opportunity. Patience is huge. And I've learned it being a firefighter and brought this into incident response. Everybody's so quick to be reactive and have tunnel vision and jump into things, and they often miss the big picture, and that's a problem. So how do you fix that? Well, patience. Really, patience is the key. Take a beat. Take a moment. One of my fire instructors says, slow is fast. I think this is an absolutely critical idea, and it's about being deliberate at what you do. Taking that beat is really important. So let me give you some examples. And I apologize that the slide transitions are so slow. All right. So now you get to see the full fire that I was working, that we saw in the beginning. Same house. Picture on the left is what we rolled up to when we had that thermal camera. With that thermal camera in our hands, we were able to see that the bulk of the fire was right under that roof. It's, again, difficult for me to point out exactly, but if you look on the right-hand side of the roof, where the smoke isn't, with that camera, we could see that's where the bulk of the fire actually was. If you look carefully, you'll see an orange glow on that right-hand side a little further under the eaves and sort of in that window. When these guys showed up to do this, instead of paying attention to where the bulk of the fire was and really kind of honing in and focusing and taking that beat, what they saw was, oh no, fire, we must go put the wet stuff on the red stuff. And as a result, we wound up with the thing you see on the right, which is instead of going in and doing what we would normally do, which would be to open and ventilate and get a lot of that smoke out and get the heat out, because again, if we reduce the amount of heat, Now we have less fire. This is a good thing. It allowed that fire to vent itself through the roof on the right-hand side. And so we were actually there for 4 hours. We could have put that out probably a lot faster, but it happens. So in incident response, we have the same kind of thing. I bring up Chegg. For those of you who aren't familiar with Chegg, Chegg is a company that, among other things, does textbook rental. And last year, they had a humongous breach with 40 million customers affected. Now, I work in the educational sector, and all of the educational sectors were notified about this breach one way or another. We got it through a trusted third party. We got a list of all the accounts that were in fact compromised, and they, as you might expect, with 40 million accounts, were substantial. Now, the problem was, in this particular case, they were not our problem in this sense. This was not our system. These were not our accounts, right? However, password reuse, it's a thing. So what happens here? We have a bunch of accounts that are compromised because people are using the same credentials. Now, why am I bringing this up? This seems like, yeah, okay, this happens all the time. Because this breach was so big and the media made such a to-do out of this, lots of educational institutions turned this into an incident. They had phone calls and meetings, and it was ridiculous. It was absolutely ridiculous. This was not an incident. What this was the same thing that happens when you have some credentials that show up in, in the I've been pwned site, right? Or you get notified that Pastebin has some credentials. You reset them. No big deal. You just reset them. The process shouldn't be any different because we weren't the ones compromised. These educational institutions weren't the ones compromised. So that's why I bring this up. If you took the beat and you said, okay, yeah, this isn't great, but it's not us, the scope of the incident changes substantially at that point. So, taking that beat, thinking about what are the real risks and implications, don't jump to OMG, WTF, BBQ. Is it really even an incident? Before you panic, even as your boss and everybody else is panicking, think about that for a minute. All right, other opportunity, accountability. Now, we don't think about accountability a ton in our computer security universe, but you're going to see why it matters. And when we think of accountability in the fire service, we're talking about knowing where our firefighters are the inside a building, outside a building, that sort of thing. If we're talking about incident response, we're talking about something similar. You want to know where your people are. You want to know what they're actually working on. And it may be the case that, you're working a criminal investigation and you need to know when people are going in and out, when they're going to be handling certain machines. So we'll see that, again, these are very similar. So on the left, you'll see an example. These are the accountability tags that firefighters wear. Typically, we keep one on our helmet and one on our coat. And the idea is that you put one of them in the truck that you're responding on so that we know where you should be ultimately. So the person who is the officer on that truck knows that he came with X number of people, and that's how many he should be leaving with, and he knows who is on that truck. If you go inside a building, or any kind of structure, you take the other tag and you leave it with the accountability person at the door. And again, this is meant for life safety, but you'll see on the right-hand side, we very similarly do that sort of thing as well, where we have logs, where we're checking in and out of rooms when we're doing certain kind of incident response. Swipe card access can be another example of this, right? We do the same kinds of things during an incident. We want to make sure that we're not stepping on each other's toes, that we're not duplicating effort. So accountability is really important. It's good to know where your people are and what they're working on. So pre-planning. Pre-planning is, again, with the fire services, is the idea that you know your buildings, you know your neighborhood, you know what's in them, you know where there are dangerous chemicals, You know where maybe portion of a building is underground. I wasn't able to find the picture I was looking for, but in one of the classes I've attended, what they'll tell you is in the fire service, we go past a building when we first show up, so we see at least 3 sides. But you never know what's on the back side of that building that you're not seeing. So typically the incident commander does what's called a 360, so that way he or she knows what is ultimately all the way around that building. Sometimes it's really handy to know that getting access to a structure to put the fire out is going to be problematic because of things like power lines, or maybe just the way that structure is built, maybe the age of it, maybe the renovations, that kind of thing. So we'll see that that plays a similar role in incident response. We need to pre-plan. We need to know where our assets are. We need to have a sense of what kind of data we are trying to protect. So these are some firefighting pre-planning examples. On the left, you see like a hotel map, right? This tells us the layout of the facility, where exits and stairs and other equipment might be. You might have a shutoff or a valve for water supply. These are all really critical. And on the right, you see a pre-plan that will tell you, are there special hazards? So all of these things need to be written up, and they need to be shared with the people who come in and are working on these fires. And if you get a fire at one of these complicated locations, it can really help minimize the disaster that could happen. The Worcester fire that I showed you, had they had a pre-plan of what that building looked like, the things that were inside of it, they might have been able to send in a team who knew what that maze kind of looked like, maybe even took a rope inside that could have done a quick sweep and come out. But unfortunately, they didn't have anything like this. In incident response, we have something fairly similar. We can do things like tabletop exercises. And for those of you who are not familiar with backdoors and breaches, Google it. It's really, really cool. It's a card game that Black Hills has put out, thanks to John Strand and his amazing team, that it follows on the same idea as Dungeons and Dragons. And so there are cards that have different categories, and it's super cool because you can play out a scenario. And the hardest part about creating a scenario to do tabletop exercise, to say, okay, let's imagine this terrible thing happened, you know, how would we deal with it, is coming up with a scenario. And what's super cool is that these cards give you the scenarios. And then they give you the scenarios, they give you maybe what tools you have, but you can still be creative and think outside the box using the tools that you're given, and how would you go about responding with this. And you can bring in not just your direct technical incident response folks, but you can even bring in, to play this game, you can bring in finance people and your HR people and figure out what their roles are. So tabletops are a great way to sort of do this kind of pre-planning we're talking about. Documentation, like I mentioned, you know, you need to know, where is your critical data? Where are the keys to your kingdom? If you don't know that, then it's really hard to know, is this something that's really a serious incident? And obviously, if you can, you want to have a formal incident response plan, team, program, whatever your organization calls it, because that's going to save you a lot of hassle, because you'll know who is supposed to be responding and what they're responsible for. So I'm going to sum up here the things that we've discussed. We want to avoid tunnel vision. Do that 360 I talked about in incident response universe. It obviously looks a little different from a house, but you know, take that step back, look at the problem as a whole. Act, don't react. So take a beat, think about what you're doing, and don't be misled by emotion. Don't let folks freelance. Follow whatever plan you've set up, which of course requires having a plan, but that's important. Have patience. Don't panic. Even as you saw with life safety issues in the fire service, taking that beat can be the difference literally between life and death, and it can be the difference between a successful incident response situation and one that isn't. So, you know, I know it seems counterintuitive, but really having patience is critical, especially in the beginning. Location, location, location. You know, make sure that you know where your people are, what they're doing, what they're supposed to be responsible for. Pre-plans rock. This is such an important thing that we often overlook because we're so busy trying to put out, quote, the fire. And by the way, that's where this idea for putting these two things together came from, right? We often talk about incident response as being a dumpster fire. And I thought, wow, I actually put fires out. Let's see how these things are similar. And of course, the incident command system. Part of the reason I mention the incident command system is I think that the incident response side of the universe could learn an awful lot from how things are managed in the fire service. The incident command system, as I mentioned before, allows you to break down who's responsible for what tasks. And the idea is that your incident commander is only talking to a couple of people at a time. And each layer in that response plan only is responsible for a couple of people at a time. So the person who's doing operations is responsible. You might have interior operations and exterior operations, right? So they're responsible for just a handful of people. And the idea is that it's scalable and it can grow to a bigger size. So if you have an incident that involves maybe a single machine, that might be something small that you could set up. But if it's something a whole lot bigger than just a single machine, now you have a way to scale it out. So some final thoughts. All of this sounds well and good, but for any of you who've done incident response, this may stretch you out from being in your comfort zone. It's different. It's a little weird. Thinking about things with this incident response plan is not what we're used to doing in the ICS incident command system way that the fire service looks at it. But as I mentioned here, great things never come from comfort zones. And with that, I'm not really sure how the Q&A portion of this will work. My understanding is that the folks who are facilitating are going to respond to raised hands. So you should ultimately have a raised hand option shortly, and they'll be able to get your questions, and I'm happy to answer them. And I thank you again so much for having me here and for those of you who came to attend.
All right. Did you say you want to open it up for questions, Cathy?
Yeah, if we can do that, that'd be great.
I think we can do a couple questions here. So I'm going to go ahead and allow hand raises. And if you have a question, please don't spam it. And if you don't have a question, please don't hit that button. But I'm going to allow hand raises here. And then if you have a question, just raise your hand and I'll try to get to as many as we can. We just have a couple minutes though, so let's try to keep it pretty short. And here we go. See, is that working?
I certainly can see the raised hand, like the option.
No. So there's okay, good. Okay. So if there's any, I just want to make sure do a sanity check, make sure everybody's got the raised hands, and everything's good. All right. So if anybody has any questions, just feel free to raise your hand using the button on the right-hand side of the screen that says raise hand, and I'll take any questions. We'll give it a few minutes here.
Okay.
Everybody give it up. Let's get some emojis in here. Share some love.